Let your body settle now. Feel the surface beneath you, its firmness, its steadiness, the way it holds you without asking anything in return. You do not need to hold yourself up. The weight of the day, the weight of whatever you carried into this moment, can begin to soften at the edges. There is nowhere else to be. There is only this, the breath moving in, filling the chest, and then the long, slow release of it. The quiet that follows. You are safe here. You are still. Before we speak of the snap, before we speak of the hand that closed around 6 impossible stones and unmade half of everything that lived, we must first understand what was, what the universe felt like when it was whole. Because destruction only means something when you can feel the shape of what was lost, when you can hold the warmth of it against your palm and know that it was real. The universe, in those years before, was vast and indifferent and full of worlds that had never heard each other's names, full of species that had evolved in parallel isolation, building languages and songs and systems of belief without ever knowing that somewhere across a span of stars too wide to comprehend, another kind of mind was doing exactly the same. This is the quiet miracle that no cosmic chronicle adequately records, the sheer persistence of life. Life in the cold places, life in the burning ones, life clinging to the undersides of moons, metabolizing in ways that no single vocabulary was built to describe. And on a planet called Earth, orbiting an average star in an unremarkable corner of one galaxy among billions, there were people living lives of ordinary enormity. A woman cooking dinner while her child drew something on the back of an envelope. A man watching the rain collect in the gutters of a city street and thinking about nothing in particular. A teenager walking home from somewhere, headphones in, the specific private music of their own interior monologue filling the space between their ears. These were not heroes. They were not soldiers or sorcerers or the wielders of ancient power. They were simply alive, in the way that life is most purely itself when it is not performing anything. You know these people, not them specifically, but their shape. You have been that person walking in the rain with no particular destination. You have been the one sitting at a table, absorbed in some small and private moment, with no awareness whatsoever that anything was coming. This is the thing about catastrophe. It does not announce itself to the ordinary, it arrives without courtesy. There was a particular quality to the light in the years before the snap that no one had thought to record because no one knew it needed recording. The light of a Tuesday afternoon, the light falling through the windows of apartments where people were living their lives without knowing they were doing something that would someday be called the before, light on coffee cups, light on the hands of someone reading, light on the face of a person looking out a window at a street below, thinking about dinner or a phone call or nothing in particular. Light that had travelled 93 million miles to fall on a Tuesday and be thoroughly unremarked upon. This is what gets lost when historians talk about events of the scale the snap represents. They talk about the event itself, the mechanism, the cause, the aftermath. They talk about the numbers. They do not adequately talk about the Tuesdays, the accumulated weight of all the ordinary days that preceded the event and that the event interrupted. Every ordinary day contains the whole of someone's life in miniature, their past and their present and their expectation of a future that is nothing dramatic, just more of what they have, more of the coffee and the light through the window and the sound of rain on glass. When something removes half of that, the arithmetic of the loss is not half. It is total for the ones who are taken, and for the ones who remain, the loss is not half either. It is the loss of the ordinary's reliability, the discovery that the Tuesday light and the coffee and the rain were never guaranteed, were always borrowed, were never the floor but only the surface of something much less stable. Meanwhile, in the dark between worlds, something was moving. Something that had been moving for a very long time. A figure of enormous physical presence and, more troublingly, of enormous internal conviction. A being who had looked at the fullness of the universe and seen in it not abundance but arithmetic. Not life but load. Not the miracle of persistence but the mathematics of collapse. His name was Thanos, and he had been travelling for a very long time, and he was almost finished. To understand what the universe felt like before the snap, you have to understand what the stones were before they were assembled. Each of the 6 infinity stones had a history that preceded the formation of the current universe. They were not created by any civilization, not forged in any fire, not carved by any hand. They were the residue of singularities that came before. concentrations of fundamental force that had survived the transition from whatever preceded existence into the existence we know. The space stone, blue and cold and humming with the geometry of distance. The reality stone, a substance more than a crystal, a dark and liquid thing that rewrote matter at a whim. The power stone, which held in its facets the destructive output of an exploding star and concentrated it into something small enough to hold. The mind stone, golden and still and impossibly ancient, carrying within it a kind of awareness that predated consciousness. The time stone, green and spinning with the revolutions of all possible clocks. The soul stone, orange and waiting and demanding. These 6 things were distributed across the universe, some hidden in plain sight, some buried, some held by civilizations that understood what they had, and some held by those who did not. They had for millennia been the subject of scholarly obsession, mythological legend, and institutional denial in roughly equal measure. The Ancient One had guarded the time stone behind the locked geometry of Kamartaj. The Collector kept the reality stone behind glass in his museum on Nowhere, which is to say he kept it in a trophy case built inside the severed head of a celestial, which tells you something about the Collector's sense of proportion. Heimdall watched the Bifrost. Nick Fury kept his secrets. The stones held their silence. And then a particular Thursday arrived in which all of that ended. But we are not there yet. We are still in the before. We are still in the time when the air on Earth smelled like rain and car exhaust and food cooking in open windows, when the light through a kitchen window was nothing more than light, when a child's drawing on the back of an envelope was nothing more than what it appeared to be. We are still in the time of ordinary unremarkable survival. The stones had been dormant in the main. This is not quite accurate. They had not been inert. They had been active in the sense that concentrated power is always active, always exerting its influence on the space around it. But they had been waiting. Waiting in the specific way that things wait when they were made for a purpose, and the purpose has not yet arrived. The Tesseract sat in its vault and pulsed with cold blue light that no one looked at because there was nothing to interpret in its pulsing. The Eye of Agamotto hung at the Sorcerer Supreme's throat and allowed the passage of time without commentary. Vision lived his careful, curious, philosophical life with a yellow gem in his forehead that he had been born around and that he understood to be part of him in the same way that anyone understands the parts of themselves they did not choose. This is the quality of the before that is most difficult to communicate. Not the drama, not the latent threat, but the ordinariness with which enormous things were embedded in the fabric of daily life. Vision making tea in a small apartment in Edinburgh, the Mind Stone in his forehead warm in the lamplight, wander across the table from him, both of them living the specific ordinary happiness of people who have found something they did not expect to find and are still a little surprised by the finding. The stone did not make this less real. The stone did not make Vision less himself. He was himself, entirely, and the stone was part of who himself was, and the tea was ordinary and the lamplight was warm and the future had not yet arrived to take it. Breathe that in, the ordinary, the unremarkable. There is so much in it, if you slow down enough to feel it. The universe's greatest trick is not the infinity stones or the celestials or the vast and wheeling architecture of galaxies. Its greatest trick is the quiet Tuesday afternoon, the cup of coffee going cold on a desk, the cat sleeping in a square of sunlight that has moved 3 inches since it lay down and it has not noticed. This is what Thanos was going to cut in half, not the dramatic, not the extraordinary. Those things would take care of themselves as they always do. What he was going to cut in half was the ordinary, the quiet Tuesdays, the rain, the drawing on the back of an envelope, half of the people who had no idea anything was coming, half of the ones cooking dinner and watching rain and walking home with music in their ears, and he believed, with a certainty that was itself a kind of wound, that this was an act of mercy. Let that settle for a moment. Do not rush past it. The most disturbing thing about Thanos is not his power. Power is simple. Power is just force. What is disturbing is the shape of his inner life, the capacity to look at a thing and call its destruction love, to hold a universe in your hand and believe that squeezing it until half the life spills out is the same as caring for it, to take mercy and invert it until it becomes something unrecognizable, and then to walk across the stars carrying that inversion as your only light. The question that the story keeps returning to, the question that makes the story more than a superhero film and more than an entertainment, is where this begins. At what point does a genuine observation become a weapon? At what point does the person who is right about something begin to believe that being right entitles them to decide? There is no clean line. There is only the slow accumulation of a particular kind of certainty, building on itself across years, until the person on the other side of it is not the person who started. Thanos began as a mathematician with a warning. He ended as the warning made flesh. The distance between those two things is not a mystery. It is a map. And the map is worth studying, because it is not a map of somewhere else. We will take our time with this. We will go slowly. The story of why Thanos wanted what he wanted is not a simple story of villainy, and it is not made simpler by rushing it. It begins, as most terrible things do, with something that was once true, a real observation, a genuine calculation, a world that actually ended. It begins with a moon called Titan, and a boy who could do math, and a room full of people who would not listen. The breath moves in, the chest rises, and then the long, slow release. Let yourself be heavy now. Let the stillness hold you. The story will be here when you arrive at it. Feel the weight of your body again. Feel how it has settled since we began. If there is tension anywhere, in the shoulders, along the jaw, behind the eyes, let it soften now. You do not need to hold any of that. The breath moves in slowly, filling the space beneath the ribs and then releases. You are being held by gravity, by the surface beneath you, by the simple fact of stillness. There is nothing required of you right now except to listen. Titan was beautiful once. Let that be the first thing said, and let it be said clearly, because it is easy to look at what Titan became and forget what it was. It was a moon, orbiting a gas giant in a system far from the one that would eventually produce Earth, and in its prime it was a civilization of such refinement that the word civilization hardly does it justice. The Titans had reached a stage of development that most species only theorize about. They had moved past war, past resource conflict, past the ordinary petty violences of early intelligence. They had built lasting things. They had built architecture that understood the geology beneath it. They had cultivated art that did not try to be permanent, and so lasted longer than the things that did. They had developed philosophy, real philosophy, the kind that costs something to think, and had arrived at systems of ethics that were nuanced and self-correcting, and took account of uncertainty. They were, in short, exactly the kind of civilization that should have survived. And they did not. The population of Titan grew. This is not a condemnation. It is not a moral failure. Life that thrives produces more life, and the Titans were very good at thriving. The problem was the carrying capacity. The moon had limits. Every moon has limits. Every planet, every system, every closed ecological loop has a ceiling beyond which the resources that sustain life begin to be consumed faster than they can be replenished. The Titans, brilliant as they were, had not solved this problem. Perhaps it is not a problem that brilliance alone can solve. Perhaps it requires a different kind of intelligence altogether, the kind that can sit with discomfort and uncertainty and resist the seduction of clean solutions. A young man named Thanos saw the ceiling. He was, by all accounts that survive, genuinely gifted. His mind was the kind of mind that functions as a precision instrument, taking in data and producing conclusions with a speed and reliability that unsettled the people around him. He could look at a system and see where it was going. He could read the trajectory of things, and what he read, in the trajectory of Titan's population against Titan's resources, was a single word: collapse. He brought this to the people who governed Titan. He laid out the mathematics. He showed them the projection curves, the depletion rates, the timelines. He was not wrong. This is the critical thing to understand. He was not wrong. The observations were accurate. The calculations were sound. The conclusion, that Titan was heading toward a civilizational catastrophe driven by unsustainable resource consumption, was correct. And then he proposed the solution. Kill half the population at random. Lottery. No bias. No class exemption. Rich and poor alike, the governing and the governed, the brilliant and the ordinary. Half, chosen without preference, removed. The remaining half would have double the resources, double the runway, double the chance at survival. The math was clean. The math was, in its own terrible way, correct. The room went very quiet, and then they removed him. Not from the conversation only, from everything. He was cast out, labelled a lunatic. The word genocide arrived in the discourse around his proposal, and it was not used sympathetically. And so Thanos left Titan. He went out into the larger universe with his conviction intact and a new piece of information grafted onto it. Not only was the universe in danger of eating itself into oblivion, but the people in the universe were too comfortable and too frightened to hear the truth of it. And then Titan fell, not in the way he predicted, not by starvation exactly, but by the cascading failures that starvation initiates. The social fractures, the resource wars, the systems that turn on each other when there is not enough to sustain cooperation. The civilization that had produced philosophy and lasting architecture and refined art collapsed. The structures remained, but empty. The surface became a ruin of what had been. Wind moved through hallways that had once held conversation. What those hallways had held before the end was the texture of ordinary civilizational life. There had been markets, presumably, where the currency of Titan's economy changed hands across counters of material that no longer existed. There had been schools where young Titans learned the principles of the physics and ethics that their civilization had spent centuries developing. There had been gathering places where the philosophical debates happened, the long, careful, self-correcting debates of a culture that had decided that being wrong was not a failure, but a stage in the process of becoming right. There had been, in short, all of the apparatus of a civilization that had earned its refinement through long effort, and that was, in the final accounting, not enough to save itself. The ruins of Titan have a specific quality that distinguishes them from other ruins. Most ruins are the remains of things that were overtaken by time, the slow subsidence of structures whose maintenance was eventually abandoned, the gradual reclamation of stone by plant and wind and weather. Titan's ruins are different because they are structurally intact. The buildings did not fall, the architecture held. What is absent from the ruins of Titan is not the infrastructure, but the people who are supposed to inhabit it. The hallways are empty because the people who walk through them are gone, not because the hallways themselves gave way. It is in this specific way the loneliest kind of ruin. Thanos came back to Titan eventually. He walked through what remained. He stood in the silence of it. And this is where something calcified in him. Something that had been fluid and arguable, and potentially open to revision became stone. Because he had been right. He had seen it coming and said so and been expelled for the telling, and then it had happened exactly as he said. And the weight of being right about something catastrophic, and of having been ignored, and of watching the consequence arrive anyway. That weight does not produce humility in everyone. In some people, it produces the hardened certainty that they alone can see what others refuse to look at. This is a pattern you may recognize. Not in Thanos specifically, his scale is particular to him, but in the psychology of the person who is dismissed and then vindicated. There is a kind of righteousness that grief and vindication produce together, and it is one of the most dangerous states a mind can occupy, because it feels like clarity. It presents itself as clarity. It has the texture of hard-won wisdom. But what it actually is permission. Permission to stop questioning yourself. Permission to act without the friction of doubt. Thanos left Titan with that permission. He went out into the universe with the certainty of a man who has watched his worst prediction come true, and concluded from it that all of his predictions are equally certain. He began to travel. He began to look at other worlds. He visited civilizations at various stages of development, and saw in each of them the same trajectory he had seen on Titan. Resource consumption, outpacing, replenishment, population curves bending toward the ceiling, the arithmetic of collapse, playing out at different speeds on different surfaces, but always playing out, and so he began to intervene. System by system, world by world. He would arrive and he would cull. He called it mercy. He called it the gift that no one wanted but everyone needed. He brought his arithmetic to worlds that had not asked for it, and applied it with a thoroughness that was, if nothing else, consistent. What is rarely recorded about the worlds Thanos touched in this period is the specific texture of what he left behind, the half that remained, the survivors of his mercy. They were not uniformly grateful. This would have surprised him if he had stayed long enough to learn it. They were predominantly traumatized. The random removal of half a population produces not stability, but a specific form of collective grief that is different from any other kind. because the removed were not the sick, not the old, not the ones who were already leaving. They were random. They were the person standing next to you who was taken while you were not. And the guilt of surviving a random selection, the specific, irrational, persistent guilt of the person who was not chosen, is not a condition that resolves into gratitude. The civilizations he touched were changed forever. Some of them survived to a kind of stability, and Thanos counted this as evidence. He kept a ledger, in his way, not a written one, but an internal accounting of outcomes. Worlds he had touched that had not subsequently collapsed. He did not keep an equally careful accounting of the suffering that preceded the stability, or of the civilizations that collapsed anyway by other means, or of the ones that had been developing solutions of their own before he arrived. He kept only the confirming data. This is what certainty does. It selects. It reads the record of its own successes and edits out the failures with such completeness that the editing becomes invisible, even to the one doing it. He was still moving through the universe in this way when, at some point, the arithmetic changed. The scope of the solution expanded. He had been working world by world, and the universe was, by any accounting, very large. At the rate he was proceeding, civilizations would be collapsing faster than he could reach them. The solution needed to scale. And it was somewhere in this calculation, somewhere in the translation from local mercy to universal mercy, that the infinity stones entered the picture. If he could hold all six, he could act everywhere at once. Not world by world, not civilization by civilization, but all of it. One moment, one act, half of everything chosen randomly, removed simultaneously, the universe reset, the resource pressure relieved, the trajectory bent away from collapse and toward survival. He began to plan, he began to seek, and as he sought, something happened to him that the plan itself does not capture. He fell in love, not with an idea, not with the abstract future he was engineering. He fell in love with a child he took from a world he had just halved. A child who would grow up to be one of the most formidable beings in the galaxy, and who would spend most of her life trying to stop him, and who would become the clearest evidence that his arithmetic had never accounted for the most complicated variable in any calculation about life. Her name was Gamora, and she is the part of the story where the numbers start to fail. Let the breath slow now. Let the image of Titan rest in your mind, the empty hallways, the wind through the ruins, the silence where civilization used to be. Let it rest without requiring you to resolve it. Some things are too large to resolve quickly. They need time, and time, right now, is something you have. Come back to the breath. Notice it first. The way it has continued without you, moving in and out with no effort on your part, keeping you alive through all of this without asking to be thanked for it. The body knows how to sustain itself. It does not require instruction. Let that be a kind of comfort. There are systems inside you that are already doing exactly what they need to do. You're already being taken care of, even now, even here in the quiet. We need to spend time inside the philosophy, not on the surface of it, not at the point where it becomes action, the gathering of stones, the building of the gauntlet, the arrival on world after world with his particular arithmetic in hand. We need to go deeper than that. We need to go to the place where the idea lives, where it breathes, where it first became something more than a desperate proposal in a room full of people who were not ready to hear it. Thanos did not think of himself as a destroyer. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the philosophy that animated him. He thought of himself as a gardener. The metaphor is his own. He returned to it repeatedly, in different forms, across different contexts. A garden left untended will overgrow itself. The strongest plants will crowd out the weaker ones, and then the crowding will consume the strongest plants as well. The soil will be depleted. The system will fail. But a gardener who tends with care, who removes what overgrows before it can damage the whole, ensures that the garden continues. The garden does not thank the gardener. The individual plants, if they could speak, would not welcome the pruning, but the garden survives. And that survival, in Thanos' accounting, is the only thing that matters. There is something seductive about this idea if you do not press on it. And the reason it is seductive is that it contains a truth. Ecosystems do have carrying capacities. Resources are genuinely finite. Civilizations do collapse under the weight of their own consumption. These are not invented premises. They are documented realities, playing out across the history of worlds both in his universe and in different registers in ours. So the observation is not the problem. The observation is accurate. The problem is the leap. The leap from accurate observation to specific prescription is where the philosophy of the knife was forged. Because there are many possible responses to a carrying capacity crisis. There is technological innovation, the development of new energy sources, new agricultural methods, new systems of distribution that reduce waste and extend the reach of what exists. There is cultural change, shifts in consumption patterns, in reproductive choices, in the social norms that govern how resources are allocated. There is expansion, the search for new worlds, new systems, new surfaces on which life can be sustained. There is cooperation, the coordination of civilizations across systems to share resources and pool solutions. Thanos dismissed all of these. He dismissed them not because he had carefully evaluated them and found them inadequate, or not only that, but because they were slow. They were uncertain. They required cooperation from beings who, in his estimation, could not be trusted to cooperate in time. They required the willingness to act before the crisis became undeniable, and in his experience, willingness was precisely what beings lacked. He had proposed a solution on Titan and been expelled. He had watched Titan fall. He had concluded from this that beings would not save themselves, and that the only entity positioned to save them was the one who had been right and ignored. This is where the philosophy of the knife comes from the combination of accurate observation, dismissed proposal, witnessed catastrophe, and the conclusion that only an external intervention of sufficient power could work. The knife is not cruelty. In his framework, the knife is efficiency. It is the refusal to allow the suffering of slow collapse when a faster resolution is available. There is a further dimension to the philosophy that is rarely examined. Thanos was not indifferent to the suffering of the half he removed. This is important to understand. He did not view the snap as a victimless act or as an act whose victims were irrelevant. He viewed it as an act whose victims were necessary, in the way that surgery's damage to the incision site is necessary, in the way that a prescribed burn's destruction of what is burned is necessary. The damage was real. The cost was real. He held the cost as real. And he concluded from the holding of it that he was the only one willing to pay it because he was the only one who could see that not paying it would cost more. Sit with that for a moment. Just sit with it, without rushing to refute it. Because there is something worth attending to in the discomfort it produces. The discomfort of an idea that has an internally coherent logic and an externally monstrous application. The universe is full of ideas like this. History is full of them. The willingness to sit with that discomfort, to look at the idea before dismissing it, is not the same as agreeing with it. It is simply the practice of understanding something accurately before deciding what you think about it. What you find, when you sit with it, is the place where the logic breaks. Not at the observation holds. Not even at the rejection of slower solutions, because there is at least an argument to be made about timelines and urgency. The break comes at randomness. The break comes at the specific insistence that the half, who are removed, must be chosen without preference. Thanos was insistent about the randomness. This was not incidental to his philosophy. It was central to it. The randomness was what made the act just in his framework. Without randomness, you are making value judgments about which lives matter more. You're deciding that the productive are more worth keeping than the unproductive, or the strong more than the weak, or the young more than the old. Thanos found these distinctions repugnant. He found them, in fact, precisely the kind of thinking that had produced civilizational inequality and resource hoarding in the first place. The randomness was the mercy. The randomness meant that the child of the most powerful ruler on a planet had exactly the same chance of being removed as the most vulnerable person in that same society. Death, as the great equalizer, applied before it could be corrupted by hierarchy. And yet the randomness is also where the philosophy collapses most completely. Because if the selection is truly random, then the outcome for any given world is not guaranteed. A world that loses half its population but retains most of its doctors, engineers, farmers, and knowledge holders is in a very different position than a world that loses half its population and loses with them the people who know how to maintain the water treatment system. The randomness does not promise stability. It promises only reduction. And reduction is not the same as salvation. He knew this on some level. He must have known it. A mind of his precision could not have missed it entirely. What he had done was something more subtle and more troubling. He had decided that the uncertainty of outcomes was acceptable, because any outcome was better than the certainty of collapse. He had decided that a universe of uneven, unpredictable survival was preferable to a universe of predictable, total failure. And he had decided this with the authority of a man who had already been right once about a world ending. The weight of Titan was behind every choice he made afterward. The empty hallways, the wind, the ruins. He carried that with him like a stone in his chest. Not as grief, exactly. Not as something he wanted to be rid of, but as evidence. The permanent, irrefutable evidence that he had been right and that being right had cost everything. What does it do to a person? To be right about something terrible and to have been ignored and then to watch the terrible thing happen? It depends on the person. In some, it produces a kind of exhausted compassion, a willingness to keep trying to convince, to keep offering the evidence, to accept that change is slow and that being right does not entitle you to force. In others, it produces what it produced in Thanos, the conclusion that persuasion has been proven impossible, that waiting has been proven fatal, and that the only remaining option is the kind of action that does not require anyone's agreement. He stopped asking. This is the quiet pivot at the centre of his story. He stopped presenting his calculations to anyone. He stopped sitting in rooms with the people who made decisions and laying out the evidence. He became, instead, the decision itself. He removed the external constraint of other minds from his process entirely, and in doing so he removed the last check on a philosophy that had been, from the beginning, one insight away from catastrophe. The insight he never had was this, that the variable he had failed to model on Titan, and had continued to fail to model across every world he visited, was not resource consumption, or population growth or carrying capacity. The variable he had failed to model was what life does when it is not under existential pressure, what it creates, what it discovers, what it becomes when the knife does not arrive. Life, left to its own devices, is not only a consumer, it is also an inventor. It finds solutions that no individual mind could have predicted, because the solutions emerge from the collective activity of billions of minds working on problems simultaneously, in parallel, across disciplines that had not yet learned they needed each other. The universe's answer to scarcity is not subtraction. It is collaboration. It is the long, slow, inefficient, interrupted, frequently failing, ultimately productive process of beings figuring things out together. Thanos could not wait for that. He had waited on Titan, and Titan had fallen. And so he carried the philosophy of the knife through the stars, polishing it against his certainty until it shone, until it looked like wisdom, until it felt like love. Consider what it means to carry a philosophy the way he carried this one, not as a position you are willing to revise, but as a load-bearing structure, the thing that holds the rest of the self upright. When a philosophy becomes structural in this way, evidence against it is not processed as evidence, it is processed as threat, a structural threat. And the response to structural threat is not revision, but reinforcement. He did not encounter resistance on the worlds he touched and conclude that his method might be wrong. He encountered resistance and concluded that the beings offering it were simply too afraid of the truth to receive it. This is a self-sealing system. Nothing from outside can penetrate it. Nothing from outside is permitted to. Consider what it means to carry a philosophy the way he carried this one. Not as a position you are willing to revise, but as a load-bearing structure, the thing that holds the rest of the self upright. When a philosophy becomes structural in this way, evidence against it is not processed as evidence. It is processed as threat, a structural threat, and the response to structural threat is not revision but reinforcement. He did not encounter resistance on the worlds he touched, and conclude that his method might be wrong. He encountered resistance and concluded that the beings offering it were simply too afraid of the truth to receive it. This is a self-sealing system. Nothing from outside can penetrate it. Nothing from outside is permitted to. What makes this pattern so worth attending to is not its scale, but its structure. The same architecture, accurate observation, dismissed warning, witnessed catastrophe, the hardening of certainty into doctrine, is available at every scale. It is what happens to the person who told their company that a product strategy was failing and was overruled and watched the product fail. It is what happens to the scientist whose climate research was dismissed by the people who made policy. It is what happens to anyone who was right about something important and was not heard, and then watched the thing they warned about come true. Most of these people do not become Thanos. Most of them become advocates, or exhausted, or both. But the structural temptation, the temptation to conclude that persuasion is impossible and force is the only language left, is available to all of them, and it does not require cosmic power to be dangerous, and the stones, waiting in their separate places across the universe, waited for him to come and collect them. Let the breath slow. Let the weight of this idea settle like sediment in still water. You do not need to carry it. You only need to let it rest where it has landed. The body is heavy. The mind is quieting. The night is doing its work. Your breathing has slowed. You may not have noticed, but it has. The body does this naturally when it is allowed to rest, when the demand to perform or respond or produce has been quietly removed. The chest rises and falls with less effort now. The spaces between thoughts are longer. This is the direction we're moving in, toward the long quiet at the centre of things. Let it come at its own pace. There is no destination to reach tonight. The gathering took years, decades, by some reckonings. Thanos moved through the universe with the patience of a geological process, slow, inexorable, and utterly indifferent to the urgency of anything happening around him. He had a plan of a scope so large that rushing any individual part of it would have been like hurrying a single step of a 10,000-mile journey. He understood scale the way very few beings do, not as an abstract concept, but as a felt reality, as something that lived in the body and governed the pace of action. Each of the 6 Infinity Stones was a problem of a different kind. This is what the chronicles of this period fail to adequately convey, the sheer variety of the obstacles involved in acquiring them. It was not a single type of challenge repeated 6 times. It was 6 entirely distinct categories of difficulty, requiring 6 entirely distinct approaches, each of which demanded something from Thanos that the others had not. The Power Stone was in some ways the most straightforward, which is not to say it was easy. It had been hidden on the planet Morag, beneath an ocean that periodically receded to reveal the ruins of a civilization that had possessed it and been destroyed by possessing it. The difficulty was not finding it. The difficulty was surviving the contact. The Power Stone does not tolerate beings of ordinary constitution. To hold it unmediated is to be consumed by the energy output of a dying star compressed into crystal form. Most beings who have touched a bare Infinity Stone have not survived the experience. Thanos held it. He held it because his physical constitution is not ordinary, but also because the conviction that he held simultaneously, the absolute certainty of his purpose, provided something that functions in him the way armor does in others. He is, in this specific way, protected by his belief. The Space Stone he took from a place that had been carrying it for a very long time without fully understanding what it had. The Tesseract, that blue cube of deceptive simplicity, had been passing through hands for centuries, each set of hands convinced that it understood the power it was holding, none of them understanding it at all. It had been on Earth. It had moved through the machinations of human and Asgardian history alike. By the time Thanos reached for it, it had arrived in the hands of someone who knew exactly what it was, and refused to relinquish it until there was nothing left to refuse with. Loki, in the end, gave it over. Not because he wanted to, but because the alternative had been made very clear, and Loki, whatever his other qualities, has always had an accurate understanding of thresholds. What happened on the Asgardian ship when Thanos came for the Space Stone is not a story of easy victory. Asgard's survivors were fighters, beings who had been through Ragnarok, who had already survived one ending of the world they knew, and were not inclined to accept another. They resisted. The resistance was real and costly and ultimately insufficient, because the gap in power between the assembled survivors of Asgard and a Thanos holding 2 Infinity Stones is not a gap that courage alone can close. There is something painful about watching courage fail against scale. It does not make the courage less real. It simply makes the scale more clear. The Reality Stone was more complicated. It exists in a form that resists the category of stone entirely, a dark, liquid solid substance called the ether, capable of rewriting the physical properties of matter at will. It had been retrieved from a dormant state and used briefly, in a conflict on Earth and Asgard, and then, crucially, given for safekeeping to the Collector on Nowhere. The Collector, that strange, ageless, acquisitive being who lived inside the skull of a dead celestial, and spent his centuries accumulating things that should not be accumulated, had accepted the reality stone into his collection without any particular plan for what to do with it. He was not planning anything. He was simply collecting. This is the kind of custodianship that ends in a specific way. The Mind Stone had a more intimate history. It had been embedded in a scepter, used as a tool of coercion and control, deployed in an invasion of Earth that failed, and then spent years in the hands of people trying to understand it. Eventually it was placed into the forehead of a being created from the collision of that scepter's AI and a body of vibranium, a being named Vision, who was gentle and curious and philosophical, and who understood when the time came exactly what the stone in his forehead would cost. Vision knew what was coming for him. He had a great deal of time to think about it. What he did with that time and the quality of the life he lived in it is one of the more quietly moving aspects of this story. Vision spent that time in Edinburgh mostly, and in the Avengers compound, and in the various other places where he was present in the specific way that Vision was present, fully, attentively, with the particular interest of a being for whom every moment was still a kind of discovery. He cooked. He read. He had conversations about consciousness with the one person in his life who did not find his questions about consciousness. Strange, because she was asking the same ones. He loved Wanda Maximoff with the specific quality of love that develops between people who found each other in the ruins of things they did not choose, and who decided, without discussion, to make something from the rubble. He knew he was going to die. He prepared for it with a thoroughness and a lack of drama that said more about his character than anything else in his story. The Time Stone was held by the masters of the mystic arts, specifically by a sorcerer supreme named Stephen Strange, who had arrived at that position by a route that involved a car accident, destroyed hands, a refusal to accept limitation, and a long and difficult apprenticeship that had transformed a man of considerable arrogance into a man of considerable humility, or at least something closer to humility than what he had been before. Strange understood the Time Stone's power better than perhaps anyone alive. He also understood, as we will see, exactly when not to use it. And the Soul Stone. The Soul Stone was the last and the strangest and the most costly. It did not sit in a museum or a scepter or a cube or a temple. It sat on a planet called Vormir, at the top of a mountain, guarded by an entity that had been waiting for someone to come and claim it for a very long time. And the cost of claiming it was not physical strength or arcane knowledge or the ability to survive energy output. The cost of claiming it was something that cannot be faked, cannot be approximated, and cannot be paid by someone who does not genuinely possess it. The cost was love. You had to sacrifice what you loved most, and Thanos loved Gamora. Let that land for a moment before we move on. The man who wanted to remove half of all life from the universe in an act he called mercy. That man loved his daughter. Not performatively, not strategically. He loved her the way that people love the things that arrived in their life unexpectedly and changed the shape of everything. She had been a small, fierce, terrified child on a world he had halved, and he had seen in her something that matched something in him, and he had taken her. He had raised her with the specific combination of cruelty and devotion that is its own kind of damage, training her to be lethal, pushing her harder than she wanted to be pushed, demanding from her a strength she had not chosen to develop, and loving her in the limited and distorted way that he understood love, through all of it. Gamora had spent her adult life trying to escape him. She had become a guardian of the galaxy, a deliberate act of self-definition, of refusing to be what he had made her, and she had built a life that was her own, with people who had chosen to be around her and whom she had chosen in return. The family she built for herself is, in its own way, one of the more remarkable things in this story. Assembled from the wreckage of various individual catastrophes, held together by the specific kind of loyalty that develops between people who have survived things together. She knew, long before the confrontation on Vormir, what her role in her father's plan was. She had searched for the Soul Stone specifically to keep it from him. She had found a map to it and then destroyed the map, and then carried the knowledge of where it was in her mind like a splinter, something that hurt to carry and that she could not remove. And when the time came, and Thanos had her, he already knew she knew. He had been told, and she saw from his face that he understood exactly what was required at Vormir. She told him he didn't love her. She said it as a dismissal, as the conclusion she had reached after decades of what he had done to her. And he wept. And this is the part that defies easy interpretation, the weeping. It is not performance. Whatever Thanos is, he is not a performer of emotions he does not feel. What he felt at that moment was grief. Real grief. The grief of a person who is about to destroy the thing they love most, and who knows it and who has decided with the full weight of their particular certainty that the destruction is necessary. He did not hesitate on Vormir. This is the thing that is hardest to hold without wanting to look away from it. He did not hesitate. He wept, and he did not hesitate, and both of those things were true simultaneously. He did not hesitate on Vormir. This is the thing that is hardest to hold without wanting to look away from it. He did not hesitate. He wept, and he did not hesitate, and both of those things were true simultaneously. What the Soulstone's transaction at Vormir ultimately reveals is a truth about Thanos that no combat ever could. You can learn a great deal about a person from how they fight, but you learn more from what they will not put down. He had carried the plan across decades and across the deaths of people and the destruction of civilizations and the burning of his own arm and the grief of Titan and all of it. And at Vormir the plan asked him to put down the only thing he had not yet been willing to sacrifice for it. And he could not. He could not put it down. He put down Gamora instead. And this is the final word on what he was. A person whose love was real, and whose love was not, in the end, stronger than the thing he had decided was more important than love. The Soul Stone was retrieved. The sixth piece of the calculation was in his hand, and the universe, in its vast and unaware majority, continued doing what it had always done. Living, building, eating, sleeping, loving, arguing, watching rain fall into city gutters, drawing on the backs of envelopes with no knowledge that the arithmetic was about to arrive. The breath moves in, the chest rises, and then the release. Let yourself go a little further into the stillness. The stones are gathered. The story is almost at the moment everyone is afraid of, but we are not rushing there. We move toward it slowly, the way night moves toward morning, with patience, with quiet, with nothing to prove. Let the stillness deepen. It has been here all along, underneath the words, underneath the story, a quiet that does not require anything of you, that exists independently of whether you are paying attention to it or not. The breath moves in and out. The body rests. And somewhere beneath the thinking mind, something older and quieter is already at peace. Let yourself sink toward that, just a little. There is nothing you need to understand tonight. There is only the listening. Vormir is not a world that invites visitors. It is a cold, dark, inhospitable place at the very edge of the galaxy's accessible territory. A planet wreathed in permanent atmospheric shadow, its surface a geography of jagged stone and absent warmth. Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there in the ordinary sense. It is a place that has been reduced to its essential function, which is the keeping of a secret that costs everything. The Soul Stone occupies a category apart from the other 5. The other stones are, in their various ways, amplifications of forces that already exist in the universe. The Space Stone bends the physics of distance. The Time Stone manipulates the physics of sequence. The Power Stone concentrates destructive energy. The Reality Stone rewrites the rules of matter. The Mind Stone interfaces with consciousness. These are extraordinary things, but they are extensions of principles that the universe already operates by. They take what is and stretch it past its normal limits. The Soul Stone is different. The Soul Stone does not amplify a natural force. It governs something that physics does not have a unit for. What it holds, what it tracks, what it counts, what it knows, is the specific interior reality of living things. Not consciousness exactly, not in the neurological sense. Something deeper than that. The animating principle that makes a being not merely a biological process but a self. The thing that, when it is present, means someone is home inside the body. The Guardians of Vormir, whatever tradition or cosmic architecture installed them there, understood something about the Soul Stone that the other stone's guardians did not. They understood that the stone should cost something equivalent to what it governs. If the stone deals in souls, then the price of the stone should be a soul. Specifically, it should be the soul that the seeker values most, not most abstractly, not their highest ideal or their deepest principle. The thing they love, the specific, irreplaceable, non-transferable thing they actually love. The mountain on Vormir is a long climb. This is not incidental. The climb gives the seeker time. Time to understand what is coming, time to feel the weight of what they are about to be asked to do, time to decide whether the prize is worth the price before the price is demanded of them. Most seekers who arrive at Vormir do not make it to the top, not because the physical ascent is beyond them, but because the psychic weight of what waits at the summit is, for most people, too heavy to carry to the top. The mountain weeds out by anticipation. Only the ones who will not stop keep going. The guardian who waited on Vormir when Thanos arrived was not a monster. He was a man who had made his own terrible choices long ago, and had been given as his particular punishment the task of presiding over this transaction for as long as it took for someone to arrive and claim the stone. He knew immediately what Thanos was there for. He also knew immediately what it would cost. He told Thanos clearly. And Thanos, who had brought Gamora with him, partly as insurance, partly because he could not bear to come to this place without her, which is its own kind of evidence, looked at his daughter and understood. Gamora laughed. She laughed with relief because she was certain he could not do it. She had lived her entire life understanding what she was to him, and she had concluded from the evidence of that life that he loved his mission more than he loved her, that his dedication to the plan exceeded his capacity for genuine attachment. The laugh was the laugh of someone who believes they have just been proven right about something they had long suspected. That he was, at the core of it, incapable of the kind of love that costs. And then he wept, and the laugh stopped. This is the moment that the film pauses on, and that the story cannot move past without attention. Because what the Soul Stone's requirement exposes is not whether Thanos loves Gamora. He does. What it exposes is the hierarchy within him. Given a choice between the plan and the person, given the specific, concrete, immediate choice between keeping Gamora alive and acquiring the stone, which one wins? And in him, the plan wins. Not because the love was false, but because the love was not, in his internal architecture, the highest value. He had organized himself around an idea. He had organized himself around the plan to the extent that the plan had become the load-bearing structure of his identity. Without it, he was not sure what remained. With it, every sacrifice, including Gamora, including his own grief, was meaningful, was part of something larger, was an expression of the mercy he genuinely believed he was enacting. The plan gave the grief a name and a purpose. Without the plan, the grief was just loss, and loss for a person of Thanos' constitution is unbearable in a way that purpose is not. Sit with that for a moment. This is the sit with it. This is the part of the story where we stop and feel the weight of a thing before moving on from it. Because what Vormir reveals about Thanos is something you may have encountered in a different key in your own life, or in the life of someone you know. The person who has organized themselves so completely around a mission, around a belief, around an identity, around a cause, that the people in their life become, not unimportant exactly, but secondary to the project. The person who loves truly, but cannot love primarily. Whose love, however real, will always be outranked by something they have decided is larger than love. This is one of the more common forms of human tragedy. It does not require cosmic power or infinity stones to operate. It operates in ordinary kitchens, at ordinary dining tables, in ordinary bedrooms where someone is present in body and absent in some more fundamental way. The person across from you is real, and you love them, and you're going to reach past them anyway, because the thing you have decided matters more is just barely out of reach, and you cannot stop now. Thanos could not stop. He had never been able to stop. He had not been able to stop on Titan when they expelled him. He had not been able to stop on every world he had visited afterward. He had not been able to stop when Gamora begged him to. He had not been able to stop when the evidence of what his interventions did to the survivors filtered back to him through the long years of his campaign. He had built a self that could not stop, and Vormir was simply where that self arrived at its specific and terrible cost. He went over the edge of the cliff with her in his arms. He held her, and then he let go, and the orange light of the Soul Stone filled his hand, and he fell to the stone floor of Vormir and woke up in a shallow pool of water, alone, with a new power in his possession and a grief so large that he could not look directly at it. The grief was real. This is not a small thing to say. The grief was real, and he carried it into the snap, and he carried it out the other side, and he carried it into the garden on the planet where he retired afterward, and it was still there in him when the Avengers came to take the stones and found that the stones were already gone. The grief did not change the plan, the grief did not introduce doubt. But the grief was real, and it sat in him like Titan's ruins sat in the landscape of Titan, the permanent mark of what had been valued and lost surrounded by what remained. There is something worth noticing about the shape of the grief and what it did not do. In most people, grief of this magnitude, grief at the direct chosen loss of a person you love, a loss you caused, produces something, not always revision, not always the conclusion that you were wrong, but at minimum it produces friction, a catch in the certainty, a moment where the clean lines of the plan feel less clean because of what they cost. Thanos' grief did not produce friction. It produced something closer to a seal, as if the very fact of having paid the price of Gamora confirmed the seriousness of the mission. You do not pay this much for something you are uncertain about. The payment becomes evidence of the payment's necessity. Gamora had been wrong about one thing. He was capable of the love that costs. She had not understood that she was the cost. She had thought the inability to stop proved the absence of love. What it actually proved was the presence of something that had been installed in him longer and deeper than any love could reach. The cold, clarifying, grief-forged certainty that he was right, that he was the only one who would act, and that the universe's survival depended on him continuing. There is a further thing to notice about the Soul Stone and what it required. The sacrifice at Vormir is not simply the loss of the loved one, it is the act of the sacrifice. The one who holds the loved one must be the one who releases them. There is no mechanism by which the loved one can simply be taken from the outside. The exchange requires the agency of the seeker. Thanos had to choose actively in the moment to let go. This is why it cannot be faked and cannot be gamed. You cannot bring someone you pretend to love and discover that pretending is insufficient. You cannot bring a proxy. You have to bring the actual thing, and then you have to be the one who releases it. The stone measures not what you feel, but what you do with what you feel when the cost is immediate and the option to stop is still available. The Soul Stone pulsed in his gauntlet. The 5th of 6, one remained. And the clock, which had been counting down across decades of preparation and acquisition, had almost reached the moment it had been counting toward all along. The breath moves in slowly, the chest rises, and then the release, long, unhurried, complete. Let the body be heavy, let the mind be quiet. The story is moving toward its center. You do not need to brace for it. You are held here, in the warmth and the dark, and nothing is asked of you except this, to rest. The darkness behind your eyes is restful tonight. There is nothing in it that requires attention, nothing that is asking to be resolved. Just the dark, and your breath in the dark, and the quiet presence of everything you do not need to hold. Let the shoulders drop a little further, let the jaw soften. The story continues and you can follow it without effort, the way you follow the sound of rain without needing to count the drops. Titan, the moon, the ruined world, not the gauntlet, was where the battle happened. The battle that almost stopped everything. Almost. They had assembled there with a plan. Tony Stark, who had been afraid of Thanos since before he had a name for the fear, since the moment a wormhole opened in the sky above New York, and something came through it that told him the universe was larger and more dangerous than anything he had been building towers against. Tony had carried that fear for years, in the particular way that engineers carry fears, by trying to design around them, by building contingency after contingency, by staying up late in workshop-like running scenarios. His fear had produced suits of armor, and a tower, and a team, and an AI, and a satellite network, and 100 other things that were all, at some level, attempts to put a wall between himself and the thing he had seen coming through the wormhole. The thing about Tony's fear that is worth attending to is its specific quality. It was not the fear of someone who did not believe they could handle what was coming. Tony Stark had spent most of his adult life handling things that other people found unhandleable. His fear was not about inadequacy. It was about scale. He had looked at the wormhole and understood, with the precision of a mind that was built for exactly this kind of assessment, that what had come through it was a signal that the universe contained things that could not be outthought or outbuilt or outmaneuvered by any single person operating with Earth's resources. He had been afraid, in short, not of failure, but of the specific kind of failure that occurs when the problem is categorically larger than the solver. He had gotten to Titan through a sequence of events that had also brought Stephen Strange, the Sorcerer Supreme with the Time Stone around his neck, and several of the Guardians of the Galaxy, who had been pursuing their own thread of the same crisis. They stood on the ruins of the world that had made Thanos, and made a plan to take the gauntlet from him. The plan was very nearly good enough. This is the thing that deserves to be said plainly. They nearly did it. Strange held the Time Stone and refused to use it as a weapon, because he understood something about time and consequences that made him careful in ways that looked like restraint but were actually precision. The Guardians fought with the familiarity of people who had survived worse situations than this one, which was not actually true but which they had collectively decided to believe, because belief is sometimes the only available resource. Stark fought with everything he had, every suit configuration, every contingency, every ounce of the reckless, focused intelligence that had spent years preparing for exactly this. They got the gauntlet off his hand. Almost. They got it almost all the way off. And then Nebula, the other daughter, the one rebuilt from salvage and pain, said something that broke the fragile equilibrium. She said the name Gamora. She said what had happened on Vormir, and Peter Quill, who had loved Gamora with the specific helpless intensity of someone who had not expected to love anyone, and then found that he did, heard the name of the dead person he loved and could not hold the plan in place against the grief of it. He struck Thanos, not strategically, and not as a calculated move that carried a risk worth taking. He struck him because the grief was larger than the plan, because some things cannot be subordinated to tactics, because the person you love is not an abstraction to be weighed against outcomes. He struck him because he was human, in the most essential sense of the word, which is to say that he was incapable in that specific moment of being anything other than what he felt. This moment has been criticized. It has been called a failure of discipline, of judgment, of basic strategic thinking. And it was all of those things. It was also the most human moment in the battle, the moment that proved, in its own inadvertent way, the thesis that Thanos' philosophy had always missed. The thesis that the most powerful thing in any of us is not the thing that can be subordinated to a plan. Peter Quill did something catastrophically wrong, and did it because of love, and in doing so became the clearest demonstration of why love cannot be removed from the equation without removing something that makes the equation worth solving. The gauntlet went back on. Thanos reclaimed it. And then Strange, who had looked at 14,605 possible futures with the Time Stone earlier in the battle, made his choice. He gave Thanos the Time Stone. He surrendered it willingly in exchange for Tony's life. And before he did, he said something that Tony heard and did not understand until much later, until the most important moment of his life, that there was no other way. One possibility out of 14,605 led to the outcome they needed. One. Strange had seen it. And the path to that one outcome ran directly through Thanos completing the snap. Thanos left Titan with all 6 stones. He went to Earth, to Wakanda, where the last stone, Vision Stone, was being protected by everyone who remained in the fight. They had removed Vision Stone with the help of the Wakandan scientists and the Mind Stone's own complex reluctance to leave the consciousness it had helped create. Wanda, who was perhaps the most powerful person on Earth at that moment, and who loved Vision with a specificity and a depth that the story does not always give her adequate credit for, destroyed the stone. She destroyed it while holding Thanos back with the full force of her power, which is to say she held back the most dangerous being in the universe, with one hand while dismantling the life of the person she loved most with the other. This is what she was capable of. This is what she was asked to do. Thanos rewound time with the Time Stone and took the stone from Vision's head intact. Vision died again. And then Thanos, with 6 stones in the gauntlet, raised his fist. Thor arrived and drove Stormbreaker through his chest, an axe forged in a dying star, the only weapon capable of killing him. Thanos looked at Thor with the calm of a man who had already completed the only thing that mattered. He said that Thor should have aimed for the head, and then he snapped his fingers. The sound of the snap itself has a quality that descriptions cannot fully convey. It was not loud. It was not the kind of sound that announces catastrophe. It was the sound a gauntlet makes when the knuckles of a very large hand close against a palm. An intimate, small, prosaic sound for an event that rewrote the living population of the universe in an instant. The sound of half of everything ending was quieter than thunder, quieter than most conversations, quieter than rain. The stones shattered under the energy output. The gauntlet was destroyed. Thanos' arm was burned to the bone from the shoulder down. He was barely alive. He used the last functional fragment of the space stone to open a portal and stepped through it, and arrived somewhere green and quiet and far from everything, and collapsed on the ground and was still. Behind him, on Wakanda's battlefield, on Titan, in New York, in Edinburgh, in cities and villages and wilderness areas and orbital stations across the universe, the air filled with something that looked like ash. People looked at their hands. Some of them had just enough time to understand what was happening. Most did not. They simply became, in the particular soft, disintegrating way that the snap expressed itself, not. Barnes was the first one Tony saw, standing there and then not. Peter Parker, the kid, the one who had been recruited into this whole impossible situation through no desire of his own, who had grabbed onto a spaceship to try to help and ended up on Titan. Peter Parker fell apart in Tony's arms and told him he didn't want to go. Tony held him. There was nothing else available to do. Strange, before he went, turned to Tony and said, "It was the only way." And then he was gone. And Tony Stark sat on the ruins of Titan, on the ruins of the world that had made Thanos injured and alone, surrounded by what the universe had become, and breathed. In and out, still alive, for reasons he could not yet understand. The light on Titan after the snap had a specific quality. It was the same light that had been there before, the distant, cold, diffuse light of a ruined world under an uncertain sky. But it fell now on a battlefield emptied of half the people who had been standing in it minutes before. The dust of them, if that's the word, hung briefly in the air and settled. Tony sat in it. He was the only person from Earth still alive on this moon, at this distance from everything he had ever called home, in this light, in this silence. He had been afraid of this moment for years, and the moment had arrived, and he was still breathing, and the breathing was, for now, all there was. There is something else to say about the snap's aftermath before we leave the ruins of Titan and return to Earth. Tony Stark, alone on that moon, had one thing left that the snap had not taken from him: the problem. He is a person who has always responded to impossible situations by converting them immediately into engineering challenges, by asking what needs to be built rather than sitting in the feeling of what has been broken. The snap had broken everything. And somewhere beneath the grief and the injury and the loneliness of being the only living person on a dead moon, a part of his mind, the part that never entirely rests, was already beginning to convert the breaking into the challenge. He did not know it yet. It would be 5 years before he acted on it. But the question had been planted in the ruin of Titan, in the quiet after the snap. What would you need to build to undo this? Let the breath move through you now, in and out. The body is heavy and warm, the mind is settling. There is something on the other side of this moment in the story, something that Strange had already seen, something that was waiting in the future like a door. We will get there, but not yet. First the quiet, first the dark, first the long exhale of everything releasing. Let your body sink a little deeper into what is holding it. The surface beneath you has not shifted. It is still there, reliable and patient, asking nothing. The breath continues on its own. The dark behind your eyes is steady. This is the middle of the night and the middle of a story, and you are resting in both of them without needing to reach the end of either. There is time. There is enough time. The word that governed the snap was random. This is worth dwelling on at length, because it is the word that separates Thanos' act from every other act of mass destruction in the history of the universe, and because it is the word that reveals the most about what he actually believed. Other catastrophes have logic. Wars are fought over territory or ideology or resources or the fear of future threat. Famines follow the failure of specific systems: agricultural, distributive, political. Plagues do not choose, but they do favour. They favour the immunocompromised, the elderly, the young, the geographically clustered. Natural disasters have no preference, but they have physics. They strike where the fault line runs, where the storm makes landfall, where the river overflows its banks. Even the most sweeping acts of historical destruction have had a target. There has always been someone who was trying to survive the thing being done, and someone who was directing it at them. Thanos' snap had no target. This was the point. This was the whole point. The randomness was not a failure of the system. It was the system. He had built the randomness in deliberately, had thought about it carefully, had concluded that it was the only form of the act that could be ethically justified in his framework. Because any act of selective removal requires a judgment about whose life matters less, and he had decided with the specific moral consistency that made him so difficult to simply dismiss as evil, that no such judgment was available to him. Who was he to decide that the poor were less worth keeping than the rich? Who was he to decide that the weak should go before the strong? Who was he to decide that the young were more valuable than the old, or the productive more worth preserving than those who had finished producing? He was, in his own accounting, nobody's judge, in that sense. He was only the surgeon. And a surgeon does not choose which cells to remove based on their individual merit. The surgeon removes a percentage, and the system, ideally, recovers. The randomness was also, in a way that he perhaps did not fully acknowledge, a protection against the specific corruption that haunts all power of this kind. If he had allowed himself to choose, if the snap had been directed rather than random, then he would have had to decide. And in deciding, he would have been exactly what he claimed not to be, a being imposing his preferences on the universe under the cover of a principle. The randomness was the only thing that kept the act in his framework from becoming ordinary tyranny. Pause here. This is the sit-with-it moment for this segment. Feel the weight of what is being described, not the horror of it, though that is real, but the internal architecture of it. The care that went into the ethics of an act that ended half of everything. The fact that the most destructive single event in the universe's recent history was the product of meticulous moral reasoning, however broken that reasoning ultimately was. This is the thing that makes the story more than a villain story. A villain does not agonize over the ethics of his method. A villain does not choose randomness in order to avoid the corruption of selective judgment. A villain does not weep on Vormir. What Thanos was is something harder to name than villain. He was a person who had taken a real problem, added a layer of personal catastrophe, subtracted the friction of other minds, and arrived at a solution that was internally coherent and cosmically monstrous. He was what happens when intelligence is paired with certainty, and certainty is never corrected by consequence. He was the end point of a particular kind of intellectual isolation, the isolation of the person who is right about something, and concludes from being right that they cannot be wrong. After the snap, the universe was different in ways that no census could fully capture. The raw numbers were simple. Half the living population of the universe removed at random. The effects were not simple at all. A planet that lost half its population but retained its critical infrastructure, its power systems, its food production, its medical knowledge, was in a vastly different position than a planet that lost, by random chance, the majority of the people who kept those systems running. The randomness that Thanos had intended as the great equalizer produced, in practice, radically unequal outcomes. Some worlds had the resources to absorb the loss and rebuild, others did not. The ones that did not face a secondary collapse, that had nothing to do with resource scarcity, and everything to do with the specific people who happened to be removed. On Earth, the loss was felt in 1,000 different registers simultaneously. Governments lost leaders and lost the institutional knowledge that kept the machinery of civilization operating. Hospitals lost patients mid-procedure and staff mid-shift. Pilots were removed from the cockpits of aircraft in flight. Parents were removed from households where children had been left in their care. The emergency services that mobilized in the aftermath of the snap were dealing not only with grief, but with the cascading practical failures of a civilization that had just lost half the people required to run itself. The grief was its own category. Grief at this scale does not function the way individual grief functions. Individual grief is a tunnel, dark and narrow and disorienting, and eventually traversable. Collective grief at this scale is more like a weather system. It has its own atmospheric pressure. It bends around obstacles and fills every available space. It is present in the voice of every stranger you speak to, in the empty chair at every table, in the specific silence of a world that was full and is now half empty. Steve Rogers stood in a support group and listened to people describe the shape of what they had lost. He had lost people too, people he had come to think of as his team, as something approaching family, assembled under circumstances he had not chosen, and had come to value precisely because they had not been chosen. He had lost them to ash in the air of an ordinary afternoon, and he sat in that circle and listened to other people's versions of the same thing and tried to be present for them, because presence was what he had to offer, and he had not yet figured out what else to do. What Steve Rogers in a support group represents is something worth holding quietly. This is a man who had been frozen for 70 years and woken into a world he did not recognize, who had rebuilt himself and his sense of purpose in that unfamiliar world, who had formed bonds that he had not expected to form, and that had become, over time, the closest thing he had to a home. He had survived so much. He had the specific durability of someone who has learned that survival is possible through almost anything, and he sat in a circle of ordinary people talking about what they had lost, and he listened, because he was not above the listening, because the grief in the room was the same grief regardless of who was feeling it, because the snap had made everyone equal in the only way that Thanos had never intended, equal in the shape of the loss. Natasha Romanoff ran the infrastructure of whatever remained of an international response operation. She sat at a table with other remaining people and tracked problems and tried to solve them and said, when asked how she was, that she was fine, because what else is there to say when the loss is total and the work is still there? She had spent her entire life being useful in situations that were impossible, and this was another one, and she was still useful, and she did not know what she would do if she stopped being useful, so she continued. Thor was somewhere else entirely. Thor, who had failed to aim for the head, who had been close enough to success to make the failure spectacular, had retreated from the failure in a direction that no one had expected. He had been, for a very long time, defined by his power and his title, and his lineage and his hammer, and all of those things had been complicated or removed or destroyed or passed to someone else, and the snap had removed half of what remained of Asgard, the remnant civilization he had been shepherding since Ragnarok, and something in him had simply, quietly, broken under the weight of all of it. He would not be found for a long time. When he was found, he would be different, in ways that were both humanizing and painful to observe. Clint Barton had been away from the fight. He had been given, by Natasha, the gift of ordinary life, a farm, a family, the specific quiet happiness of someone who had stepped back from extraordinary danger and found that ordinary life was, in fact, extraordinary in its own right. The snap took his family in front of him, his wife, his children, the specific ordinary life that had made the rest of the work bearable. Gone, random, no different from the person who was taken on a battlefield or in a hospital or in a spaceship. Random, equal in its randomness. He became something different after that, something harder and less careful and more dangerous, and it is one of the more painful illustrations of what the randomness actually looked like when it landed on specific lives. Half of everything. This is what Thanos' mercy looked like from the inside of it. Not an abstraction, not a statistic, not a curve on a graph bending away from collapse. It looked like an empty chair at a kitchen table. It looked like a pilot seat suddenly unoccupied over a city of people who did not yet know to be afraid. It looked like a child's drawing on the back of an envelope, found later by the person who was not taken, who would keep it and not know what to do with the keeping. The 5-year period that followed the snap was one of the most thoroughly documented intervals of collective human adaptation in the record. People adapted. This is what people do. They build their lives around the shape of what they have lost, and then the shape becomes familiar, and the familiar becomes, not normal exactly, but livable. The empty chairs were still empty, but they were no longer shocking. The support groups that had been formed in crisis became communities. The systems that had nearly failed were rebuilt, sometimes better than before, by the half that remained, and by the specific ingenuity that crisis produces in people who have no other option. The universe that Thanos had intended as a mercy was, for the half that remained in it, slowly and imperfectly becoming something survivable. Not because he had been right, but because being human, being alive in the most basic sense, includes the capacity to survive things that should not be survivable. And still, somewhere in a green and quiet garden far from all of it, the architect of this mercy slept. The breath is slow now. You may have noticed that the distance between thoughts has grown, that the space between one idea and the next has widened into something almost restful. This is the direction your body has been moving all along, finding its way toward the deep rest that it knows how to reach when it is given permission. The story is here, the night is here, and so are you, at the center of both, with nothing required except this gentle attention. He found a planet that was not on any chart that mattered, a place of long grass and simple light, and the kind of quiet that has nothing in it, not the quiet of aftermath or of held breath, but the quiet of a place that has never been loud. He chose it deliberately. He had thought about what came after, in the long years of the before, and he had decided that what came after was this, the putting down of the instrument, the end of the work, the garden. Thanos in retirement is one of the stranger images in a story full of strange images. He had spent decades moving through the universe as a force of change, as something that arrived and altered things irrevocably and left before the full consequences could be traced back to him. He had been enormous, in the sense that his presence distorted the space around it. Every room he entered became about him. Every planet he visited was forever marked by the visit. And then, the morning after the snap, he put down the gauntlet and went to a planet no one would think to look for, and started doing something that no chronicle of his life had ever anticipated. He farmed. He built a shelter. He planted things. He watched the light change across the grass in the long, unhurried way that light changes when there is no schedule to keep, and no consequence waiting for the attention to drift. He cooked, though what he cooked was simple, and the cooking was not the point. The point was the rhythm of it, the dailiness, the series of small repeated actions that structure time without demanding that time mean anything in particular. This is what peace looked like for a man who had done what he had done. Not triumph, not celebration, not the satisfaction of an architect surveying a completed building. Something quieter and stranger than any of those. The specific stillness of a person who has finished the only thing they believed in and is now simply waiting to find out what remains. The planet's sun rose and set with a different rhythm than anything he had known before. He adjusted to it. He adjusted to the quality of the light. Cooler than Titan's sun had been, warmer than the light of nowhere's industrial luminescence. He adjusted to the sound of the wind in the long grass, which was constant in the mornings and absent in the afternoons and returned in the evenings with a quality that was almost conversational. He had not lived in a place with weather before, not really, not weather in the sense of something that varied day to day and created a rhythm that a person could calibrate themselves against. He found himself calibrating. This surprised him. He was injured. The arm that had held the gauntlet during the snap had been burned to uselessness. The combination of energy output from 6 infinity stones at full activation had destroyed the physical structure of the limb from the shoulder down. He wore the gauntlet still, in those first days, until he was certain the work was done and the stones had served their purpose. And then he used them one more time, to destroy them, to ensure that what had been done could not be undone. The energy of that secondary use, the use of 6 depleted stones to destroy themselves, finished what the snap had started with his arm and spread the damage through his body in ways that would never fully repair. He accepted this without complaint. This is notable. He had never been a being who complained about the cost to himself of the things he did. He had always operated on the principle that the goal was worth whatever it required from him personally, and the cost to his body was simply another instance of that principle in operation. He sat in the light of his new planet and felt the damage in his arm and thought about the garden, and did not wish the cost had been different. What he thought about in the garden, this is conjecture, because the garden was private, and he was alone in it, and he kept no record, was probably Gamora. He had thought about her before the snap, while the plan was still in motion, and the thinking had been survivable, because the plan provided a frame for it. Her sacrifice was part of the larger mercy, was the price of the universe's survival, was meaningful in a context that extended beyond the two of them. After the snap, the frame was gone. The plan was complete. The thinking about Gamora had nowhere to go except inward. He had a vision of her. There is an account, strange and difficult to interpret, of Thanos in the immediate aftermath of the snap, passing through something like an interior space and finding a small version of Gamora waiting there. Young, as she had been when he first took her. She asked him what the completion had cost. He told her everything. She looked at him with the specific eyes of a child who understands something an adult has not said, and he woke up in his garden, and the air smelled like long grass, and his arm would not move. The vision did not resolve anything. This is important to say. People sometimes describe the vision as evidence of regret, as the moment when Thanos' certainty cracked and he saw what he had truly done. It was not that. It was something more ambiguous and more painful than regret. It was the recognition that the completion of the plan had not produced the serenity he had expected. He had believed, in some part of himself, that when the work was done, the grief would lift, that the mercy he had enacted would fill the space where the grief lived, and become something that felt like peace. The garden was supposed to feel like peace. The garden felt instead like the long, unstructured aftermath of something he had not entirely reckoned with. When the Avengers came to find him, 3 weeks after the snap, they came with a purpose that was both practical and emotional. They wanted the stones. They wanted to undo what had been done. They arrived on his planet with the specific focused urgency of people who have not yet accepted what has happened, and believe that there is still a mechanism available to change it. He told them the stones were gone. He had used them to destroy themselves. He understood what this meant to them and said it anyway because saying otherwise would have been a lie, and he had never been a liar. The stones existed only to do what they had done. They had done it. They were finished. The universe was now what it was, and what it was the intended outcome, and there was nothing left to reverse it with. Thor killed him. He aimed for the head this time. It was swift and it was quiet, and the planet continued its slow rotation in the light of whatever star it orbited, and the long grass continued to move in whatever wind crossed it, and the garden that Thanos had started was still there, half-tended with seeds in the ground that would or would not grow depending on what the soil decided to do with them, and the universe that he had made, the half-full universe, the universe of empty chairs and missing pilots and support groups and Natasha Romanoff sitting at her table, running operations, and Steve Rogers listening to Grief in a Circle, continued. For 5 years, it continued. The people who remained built their accommodations with the loss. Some of them rebuilt, some of them did not. The world kept going in the particular stubborn, unremarkable way that worlds keep going after terrible things, one ordinary day following another, the cup of coffee going cold on the desk, the cat sleeping in its square of sunlight. Tony Stark built a house on a lake and built a daughter, and tried very hard to believe that the world he had now was the only world available to him, and that reaching back for what had been lost would cost more than he was willing to pay. He was almost right about that. Almost. The garden on Thanos' planet eventually grew without him. The seeds he had put in the ground were indifferent to the fact of his death. They were seeds. They did what seeds do, and the long grass moved around them, and the light changed across the field in the unhurried way it had always changed, and the planet went on orbiting its star with the same patient indifference it had maintained before Thanos arrived and after he left. The universe, it turned out, does not require the architect of its current state in order to continue being its current state. This is either comforting or disturbing depending on what you think about the relationship between what is made and the one who makes it. Thanos had believed that the universe needed him to save it from itself. The universe in his absence did not appear to notice that it had been saved. It simply continued, full of loss and full of life, orbiting and breathing and building and grieving, exactly as it would have done if he had never acted at all. Bruce Banner had spent the 5 years doing something that no one had anticipated. He had resolved the conflict that had defined him since the accident that created the Hulk. He had found a way to exist as both things simultaneously, the scientist and the other thing, the mind and the body, the man who thought and the creature who could not be stopped. He had merged them. He walked through the world as Banner and as Hulk at once, and the combination was, by his own assessment, the best of both of them. This is what 5 years of unstructured time can do for a person. It can give them the space to solve a problem that urgency had always prevented them from approaching. The snap, in this specific and narrow way, had given Bruce Banner the gift of enough quiet to become who he had been trying to become since the beginning. Natasha Romanoff, by contrast, had used the 5 years as pure continuity. She had kept working. She had sat at her table and tracked the problems and run the operations and checked in with the far-flung remaining heroes and held together what could be held. Her grief was real, but she had folded it into the work so completely that it was almost impossible to see the seam. This is a specific kind of strength, not the strength of the person who processes and releases, but the strength of the person who converts, who takes grief as fuel and runs on it for as long as the fuel holds. She had been doing this her whole life. The snap gave her 5 more years of practice. Tony Stark had done what he said he would do. He had stopped. He had built the house on the lake and made the daughter, and tried, with more success than anyone who knew his history would have predicted, to be present for the ordinary life. He had a bench on a dock where he sat in the mornings and watched the water and did not, for whole stretches of time, think about what he had lost or what was still out there or what might need to be done. He was not entirely successful at this. The restlessness that had produced the suits and the tower and the satellites was not a thing that went away. but he contained it, mostly. For 5 years he contained it, and built something from the containing. Let the breath move through you one more time. In. The chest rises, and then the release, full and unhurried and complete. The garden is quiet. The story is not over, but the person at the centre of it has rested, and the 5 years have passed, and something is about to change. You are deeper into the night now. The thinking mind has quieted. What remains is something softer, an awareness that is present but not effortful, that receives what comes without reaching for it. Let the body be completely heavy. Let the eyes rest. The story has one more act to move through, and you can move through it without needing to do anything at all. The words will carry you. 5 years after the snap, Scott Lang crawled out of a quantum tunnel in the back of a van and did not know that 5 years had passed. He thought it had been 5 hours. The quantum realm, that subatomic architecture of folded space and non-standard time, had held him outside of normal temporal sequence while the universe around him changed, and when it released him, he was returned to a world that was half empty, and had learned to live with the half-emptying, but in which a specific scientific insight had just become available that had not been available before. Time travel, or something close enough to time travel to matter. The ability to use the quantum realm as a transit medium for moving through time, not as a trick, not as a paradox machine, but as a practical mechanism for reaching a specific point in the past, retrieving the Infinity Stones from their locations before Thanos collected them, and using them in the present to reverse the snap without displacing anyone from the timeline they currently occupied. It took Banner to work out the physics. It took Stark to build the technology. It took the assembled remaining Avengers to execute the plan, and it took a journey to specific points in the past, to the Battle of New York in 2012, to Asgard in 2013, to a space station in 2014, to Morag in 2014, and to Vormir in 2014, to acquire the 6 stones that Thanos had since destroyed. The past, it turned out, was accessible, and accessible pasts have a quality that the present does not. In them, everything has already happened, and nothing has been changed yet. They are frozen in their own moment, continuing as they always did, with no knowledge of what is coming and no way to be warned. On Morag in 2014, Nebula and War Machine arrived to retrieve the Power Stone before Quill found it. They got the stone, and then something happened that no one had planned for, the Nebula from 2014. Thanos' Nebula, the one who had not yet become the Nebula who had chosen differently, made contact with the present Nebula through a shared neural network. Their memories touched, and the 2014 Thanos, still years away from the completion of the plan, saw through that shared connection what the future held. He saw everything. He saw the snap. He saw the garden. He saw his retirement. He saw the Avengers coming back to undo it. It is worth pausing to consider what this experience must have been for him, to see your own future, not as speculation, not as extrapolation from current trajectories, but as direct memory from a version of yourself that has already lived it, is an experience without precedent. He saw himself completing the work. He saw himself in the garden. He saw himself at peace. And then he saw the Avengers arriving in that garden, and the peace becoming history, and the work becoming undone, and the universe reverting to the state that his entire life's effort had been directed at changing. This is the moment where the story takes its most interesting turn. Because the 2014 Thanos, upon seeing the future, did not feel vindicated. He did not look at the evidence of his plan's completion and feel the satisfaction of seeing his work confirmed. He felt something else entirely, something that the completed Thanos, the Garden Thanos, the one who had finished the work, had not felt. He felt threatened. The difference between the Thanos who completed the snap and the Thanos who saw the future in 2014 is a difference that tells you something important about what certainty does over time. The completed Thanos had arrived at a kind of peace with what he had done. He sat in his garden. He accepted the cost. He told the Avengers the stones were gone without anger or defensiveness, because a man who is certain he has done the right thing does not need to defend it. He had done the work, accepted the cost, retired. His certainty had settled into something that looked, at a distance, almost like serenity. The 2014 Thanos, still in the middle of the plan, still with years of work ahead of him, still with every major sacrifice still to be made, this Thanos saw the future and was afraid. Afraid not of failure exactly, but of impermanence. What he saw was that the people he intended to save would use that saving as the platform for undoing the save, that the grateful universe would come back for the stones, that the universe he had protected would not accept its protection. And in response to that fear, his plan changed. No longer would he remove half of everything and retire. Now he would remove everything and build it new. A new universe from scratch that did not know the old one, that had no memory of what had existed before, no possibility of mourning it, no capacity to organize against him. A clean slate. Not a pruned garden, but a completely new garden, built from the soil up, free of the ingratitude and the resistance and the organized effort to undo what he had done. Sit with this for a moment, because it is the crucial difference. The Thanos who completed the snap believed, however broken the belief, in the beings he was saving. He believed that they would survive, that they would use the relief of halved population pressure to build something better, that they would eventually understand what had been done for them. His mercy, however distorted, still contained something that looked like respect for the capacity of others to survive and adapt. The 2014 Thanos had seen that they would not accept it, and he shifted from mercy to erasure, from pruning to burning, from the gardener to the one who pulls everything up by the roots and begins again. This is the sit with it, the observation that the one thing capable of corrupting Thanos' already broken philosophy further was the sight of the future. What he saw in the future was that the beings he intended to save did not want to be saved by him, and rather than taking that as evidence that his method was wrong, he took it as evidence that the beings themselves needed to be replaced. This is what happens to certainty when it's confronted with resistance. Not all certainty, not the ordinary human experience of being confident in something and then revising it when the evidence changes. This specific kind of certainty, the kind that has survived being right about a catastrophe, that has been expelled and vindicated, that has done the largest act imaginable in service of the idea it holds. This kind of certainty, when confronted with evidence that it is unwanted, does not revise. It expands. It concludes that the problem is not the idea but the beings who cannot receive it. It concludes that the solution is not a different method but a different population. The 2014 Thanos captured the present nebula, used her to bring his full army through the quantum realm into the present, and arrived at the ruined facility where the Avengers had assembled with the restored stones, at the moment when Bruce Banner had already used the stones to reverse the snap and the Dusted had just begun to return. He arrived with the intention of finishing what he had started, but larger. He arrived to complete the erasure, and found himself confronted with everyone, every person who had survived, and every person who had been returned, assembled in the rubble of the facility, on a battlefield that was also a reckoning. Steve Rogers, with a broken shield and the hammer of Thor in his hand, a weapon whose worthiness requirement he had apparently met at some point when no one was paying attention. Tony Stark, who had carried the fear of this moment since before he had a name for it, and had spent every intervening year preparing, and was now here, inside the moment, with everything he had built surrounding him. Wanda Maximoff, who had lost vision twice, and had reasons that required no philosophical framing. And the Thanos who arrived at this battle was not the Thanos of the garden. He was the Thanos of 2014, younger, harder, less worn, with the specific capacity for violence of someone who has not yet paid the cost that the future version had paid. He was, in a way, less human than the one the Avengers had known. The garden Thanos had grieved. The 2014 Thanos had only calculated. There is something worth noting about the specific quality of the 2014 Thanos' arrival on that battlefield. He came without hesitation, without grief, without the specific weight that the completed version had carried. He came as the plan, not as a person. And this, in an odd way, made him more manageable than the other version had been. Because the completed Thanos had been complicated by his suffering, had been made strange and difficult to read by the grief and the cost and the long years of carrying the weight of what he had done. The 2014 Thanos was simpler. He was the idea before the idea had cost him anything, and simple things, however powerful, are easier to oppose than complicated ones. The Avengers who assembled for the time heist were not the same people who had assembled for the original fight. 5 years is enough time to change a person substantially, especially 5 years under the specific pressure of the post-snap world. They came together in Stark's garage and stood in the space between who they had been and who they needed to be, and the discomfort of that space was visible in all of them. They were older, they were different. Some of them had processed the loss and some of them had not, and the ones who had not were carrying it like ballast, heavy in ways that slowed them, dense in ways that changed their centre of gravity. What the time heist required, beyond the technology and the planning and the specific knowledge of past events, was the willingness to go back. Not literally into the past only, but psychologically back, to the versions of themselves that had existed before the loss, to the battles they had already fought, to the faces of the people they had been unable to protect. Tony went back to 2012 and walked through the wreckage of his own first battle, and encountered his father at the moment when his father was still young and uncertain and human, in ways that distance and death had obscured. Steve went back to 1970 and encountered Peggy Carter through a glass partition, living her life without him, whole and purposeful and beautiful, and had to hold everything he felt about that in a body that had not stopped loving her. These were not easy things to do. They did the things anyway. The breath moves in slowly, the chest rises, and then the release. The battle is ahead, and we will come to it gently, as we come to everything in this telling. Not with urgency or alarm, but with the quiet attention that difficult things deserve. You are safe in the dark. The story will resolve. It always does. The night is very deep now. The thinking mind is quiet. What remains is the simplest version of your attention, open, unhurried, resting in the sound of the narration the way you might rest in the sound of rain. The story is completing itself. You do not need to hold any of it. You only need to be here, in the warmth and the dark, while the last of it moves through you. Before the battle, before the last confrontation, there was a moment that no one saw but that the story cannot be told without. Bruce Banner, wearing a gauntlet assembled in a matter of weeks from technology that had never been tested, and containing 6 stones whose combined energy output had nearly killed Thanos, even with his physical constitution, raised his hand and closed his fist. He'd spent months arguing that he was the right person for this, that the stones operated on gamma energy, and that he was, in some biological sense, made of gamma energy, and that if anyone could survive the act, it was him. He was right. He survived it. He was also in agony for the full duration of the act, and the damage to his arm was permanent. He raised that arm and he snapped his fingers, and the universe began to return what had been taken from it, beginning with the birds in the sky above the compound, and ending minutes later with the arrival of an army. Before we speak of the battle, let us speak of what the return felt like. The people who had been dusted for 5 years did not experience the 5 years. For them, the time between the snap and the reverse was nothing. Not darkness, not waiting, not the passage of any perceivable interval. One moment they were dissolving, the next they were reforming, in the same locations they had been when they were taken, which in many cases was a battlefield or a hospital or a spaceship. For them, no time had passed. The war was still happening. They came back fighting. The battle at the facility was not a battle between good and evil, though it was that too. It was a battle between 2 understandings of what it means to care for something. The 2014 Thanos had arrived with the conviction that the universe needed to be remade, emptied and rebuilt and given no memory of what it had been, so that it could not grieve it, could not reach back for it, could not organize to restore it. This is one understanding of mercy, the removal of the capacity to suffer by removing the continuity of the self that suffers. Against this was assembled every person who had ever refused that kind of mercy. Steve Rogers, who had refused it in the form of a serum that would have made him more effective but less himself. Tony Stark, who had refused it in the form of every armoured contingency that tried to remove him from the equation and keep him safe at the cost of being present. Wanda Maximoff, who had refused it in the form of every invitation to be defined by her loss, rather than by what she chose to do with the life that remained after the loss. Thor, who had refused it in the form of every version of himself that was smaller and more manageable and less painful to be. Nebula, who had refused it in the form of the programming that had told her she was only what her father had made her. And Peter Parker, who was 17 years old and had once told Tony Stark that when you can do the things he could do and bad things happen, you believe it happened because you didn't do enough, and who showed up on this battlefield with no hesitation whatsoever, because he had always understood, at some level below articulation, what the work was for. The battle was enormous, and I will not linger on its violence, because the violence is not the point. What matters about the battle is what it produced. The moment when Tony Stark, with the stones that Thanos had just tried to reclaim, did the thing that Strange had seen in 14,605 possible futures as the only path to this outcome. He wore the stones on his own hand, a hand that was not built for this, a body that was not Thanos's, and would not survive what Thanos's had barely survived. And he snapped his fingers, and Thanos's army became ash, and Thanos himself, sitting on a rock in the rubble of the battlefield, became ash. He sat there for a moment before the end and seemed to understand that this was the end, and seemed, in some reading of his face, to accept it. He had done what he believed he needed to do. He had been stopped. The universe had, in its own complicated and costly way, said no, and he sat in that no, in the last moment before it consumed him, and was still. Tony Stark died from the energy output of the snap. The body cannot sustain contact with 6 Infinity Stones at full activation. Not for long, not without consequence. He had known this was a possibility. He had known it for years, in the specific way that people who have been afraid of something for a long time come to know the shape of their fear and to live in relation to it. He died on a field of ruined grass, surrounded by the people who had been assembled by the specific gravity of his presence across many years and many impossible situations, and someone closed his eyes. What Tony Stark proved, in that moment, is the thing that Thanos' entire philosophy had failed to account for. Thanos believed that the universe needed an external agent of sufficient power to save it from itself. He believed that life, left to its own tendencies, would consume itself into oblivion. He believed that the love that existed between beings was insufficient protection against the arithmetic of collapse, that the warmth of it was real, but too local, too undirected, too variable to function as a systemic solution. Tony Stark disproved this with a gesture. Not because he was the most powerful being present on that battlefield. He was not. Not because he had the best plan. Strange had the plan, and Strange's plan required Tony to be willing to be the instrument of it, which is different from being the architect. Tony disproved Thanos' thesis about love's insufficiency by being willing to spend the only thing he had left to spend. The life he had built, the daughter on the lake, the ordinary, unextraordinary, irreplaceable private happiness of a man who had come all this way from a cave in Afghanistan and an arc reactor in his chest and had made something worth coming home to. He spent all of it, freely, without being asked twice. This is what the universe said back to Thanos, not an argument, not a counter-theory, not a correction of his arithmetic. The universe said, there is a category of value that your calculations have not included, and the name of that category is what a person will freely choose to lose everything for. And it is not a weakness. It is the most powerful force available to any being, anywhere, under any conditions, against any opponent. The modern echo of Thanos' story is not about genocide or cosmic power or the mechanics of the snap. It is about the seduction of the clean solution, about the specific danger of a mind that is intelligent enough to see real problems clearly and certain enough to believe that the cost of the solution is worth paying because the alternative is worse. You have met this mind, not at the scale of the universe, almost certainly not, but in smaller rooms, in relationships, in institutions, in the conversations you have had with people who were absolutely sure they were right, and who were, on some level, not wrong, and who had arrived at a conclusion that required something of you that you were not willing to give. The Thanos in the story is outside you, but the philosophy of the knife, the belief that a clean and final solution is more merciful than the messy, slow, uncertain process of beings figuring things out together, that philosophy is not outside you. It is available to any mind under sufficient pressure when the messy process has failed too many times and the certainty of the clean solution is wearing the face of wisdom. The answer to it is not a stronger argument. The answer to it is what Tony gave, the willingness to remain in the mess, to stay in the uncertainty, to be the kind of person who shows up on the battlefield not because they have calculated the optimal outcome, but because the people there are people they love, and showing up is what love does when it is being most completely itself. The universe after the Battle of Earth continued. Tony's daughter grew up. Steve Rogers gave the shield to someone who would carry it forward and went somewhere quiet. The world rebuilt itself in the particular way that worlds rebuild, imperfectly, slowly, with setbacks and arguments, and days when the weight of what had been lost was heavier than the weight of what remained, and days when the reverse was true. Half of everything had been taken, and half of everything had been returned, and in the space between the taking and the returning, the universe had learned something about itself that it could not have learned any other way. That the most powerful force in it is not a stone or a weapon or a gauntlet, or the iron will of a being who has been right about catastrophe. The most powerful force in it is the refusal of ordinary people to accept that the best that can be done for them is to remove half of them. The most powerful force in it is the insistence on the mess, on the slow and the uncertain, and the together, on the belief, held against all evidence of history's tendency toward collapse, that there is something worth protecting in the specific texture of individual lives, the cup of coffee going cold, the drawing on the back of the envelope, the person walking home in the rain with music in their ears. And that this worth is not diminished by the fragility of the things that carry it. Let the eyes close fully now, if they have not already. The body is heavy and warm, the mind is soft at the edges, the night is here, and the story is complete, and there is nothing more required of you tonight except the long, drifting quiet that is already beginning somewhere beneath the words, the breath in, the slow release, the dark that holds you, the morning that will come in its own time, unhurried, exactly when it comes. For now there is only this, the stillness and the warmth and the sound of the night doing what nights do, holding everything gently until the light returns. Let the last of the story settle like the last note of a piece of music that has finished and whose resonance is still in the air. You carried it all the way here. You do not need to carry it further. It has done what it was meant to do, and you have done what you came here to do. Rest now. The story knows where it ends. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.